Peace, family. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This is another installment of Streets to the Statehouse. This is our podcast that we use to keep people informed about some of the work that we're doing in the Maryland General Assembly, as well as some of our partners that are aligned in the perspective and worldview that we have. This is going to be different than the past several podcasts. We're going to have a guest and talk about just, a general issue that both has national and local implications. Before I do that, just a couple of housekeeping things. First is that for those who aren't familiar, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, grassroots think tank, revolutionary Pan-African nationalist perspective. One of the things I'm extremely proud of is that we're an organization that's able to infuse a radical Black perspective into the local and statewide political landscape. And so we're able to bring a perspective on policy that I don't think too often is represented in many mainstream advocacy and media contexts. And so we're really proud of the work they were able to do in the perspective that we're able to bring. And so if you're interested in, advancing some of this work, it'll be helpful to become sustainers. We're an organization that's unapologetic in our advocacy as it relates to Black people and our solidarity with oppressed people more broadly. And so if you want an unapologetic perspective, both in terms of this commentary and our work, please, decide to be a sustainer. Check out our work on lbsbaltimore.com or LBS Baltimore on all your relevant social media if you want to support Be a Sustainer, or join our email list. Some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today are things that you can have an impact on, right? Calling your legislator, sending them an email. And those things can seem really small, but they make a huge difference. Elect people in elected office, what they care about, as they care about getting reelected. And if they see that there are large numbers of people that are urging in a particular direction, it impacts their behavior. And I know firsthand the experience of those kinds of calls, the leverage that it produces in terms of advocacy on many of these issues. So that just kind of is a bit of housekeeping. And then the second bit of housekeeping before we jump in to really the substance of today's podcast is that over the past couple of days, if you go to LBS's IG, you will see that there are a few IG live videos that I did over the past couple of days, over the past few days, for the purpose of giving some general updates on our legislative priorities. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail on some of our legislative priorities. You can go check out those Instagram live videos. And we'll be back next week to do a more comprehensive review of some of our legislative work over the past several weeks. What I want to do today, though, is use this as an opportunity to talk about an issue that I think too often is often understood as an issue that's separate from Black people, right? As I mentioned at the top, our perspective as revolutionary Pan-African nationalists, the notion of racism and white supremacy and its impact on Black people throughout the diaspora. So you don't have to yourself connect to or feel kinship with folks of African descent around the diaspora. The reality is that the larger societal forces that negatively impact Black people impact all Black people, regardless of your own feelings of connection to the larger diaspora or not. And so when we think about the issue of immigration, right, an issue that is a major hot button topic, it is an issue that in many ways was a part of the kind of the fear mongering that was a part of the national presidential election in 2024 with Donald Trump and the Republicans. That's a big part of their political agenda. And when you think about the fact that the United States in the next 20 years or so is slated to become a majority non-white country, and anybody who is familiar with Frances Cress Welsing's ISIS papers, where she talks about, white folks' fear of genetic annihilation, they don't produce melanin. Her argument is that a part of what makes the system of white supremacy, what initiated it, right, was the anxiety that white folks have about the presence of non-white folks, Black people of African descent in particular. And so in many respects, when we look at the political base of someone like Donald Trump, right, and the Republicans, there are folks in that base that are likely to be folks who would be energized by policies that would demean and denigrate folks who are immigrants. And this is something that's important for Black people. So that's a discussion that we're about to have today, is we're going to talk specifically about both the policies that advocates are trying to move in Annapolis to protect immigrants from the right-wing political agenda that was kind of laid bare in this last presidential election, and provide just some context and information as to how folks can contribute to doing the work to help protect immigrants from this kind of right-wing backlash. And with me today will be a good friend of mine, Cathryn Jackson from CASA, who's going to join me in this discussion about the work to protect immigrants and their families here in Maryland. So I'm going to welcome Kat onto the screen.
Hey, Dayvon.
Hey, Kat, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me on. There's a lot
Yeah,
going on, and I'm
yeah. No,
grateful. Been grateful to all the work LBS is doing always.
yeah. No, look, it's a pleasure. And I'm glad that me and you are having this conversation because I think we've had so many conversations over the years, not just about Annapolis and its dynamics, but just some of the
Mm,
particular ways when we talk about racism and white supremacy, like all the different vestiges of oppression and domination, and immigration being one of those vectors that I think there isn't enough precise conversation about it. So for me, this is going to be a really important opportunity to have that conversation, particularly in the context where, as people are talking about immigration and some of the kind of old tactics of the divide and conquer, right, where immigration is
mhm.
characterized as an issue that is, taking resources away from Black people, right? So, like, those are the narratives that I think often get used to create this wedge. And in addition to that, as I kind of mentioned in the introduction, is if there aren't Black folks who are also immigrants, right? So those are
Right.
so my hope is that this conversation is a way to do a deeper examination of those dynamics, and then again to talk about some of the policies that you're working on and that we all want to support to protect our community from the dangers of the right wing backlash on immigration. So let's do this. I've already kind of set a bunch of background and context, and there's one area that I want to focus on in terms of conversation. But before I do that,
Mhm.
why don't you just give those listening just a general rundown of the policies that you're working on, the impact that they'll have. So why don't you start with that?
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you again for having me. I'm super honored. Um, there's a lot going on right now. And I feel like you framed up this conversation so well because first and foremost, I mean, this is kind of a simple thing to say, but first and foremost, like immigration is a Black issue, period. And I think that in the national conversation on immigration, Black immigrants are completely excluded from that conversation. And folks are very focused on Latinos, and they're focused predominantly non-Black Latinos at the border um, and the crisis at the border, right? Um, when in reality, right, even though there's a smaller population of Black immigrants in comparison to the broader immigrant population, we get impacted the most, right? And so, one of the things that brought me into immigration was just that it was an issue that impacted my family, right? My family from Trinidad and Tobago and from Guyana. Maryland is one of the is the home, one of I want to say number 5 or 6 of the top states that have the highest Black immigrant population. So whether you're from the West Indies, like my family, right, or from the continent, Colombia, I mean, just like there's a range, right? We're everywhere. And we come from everywhere. And so this conversation is just super relevant. Policies are working on. So a lot of people think that immigration is a federal issue only. And you will hear people say, you know, um, there's nothing we can do at the state level. We just need to pass comprehensive immigration reform. We need a new president. We need Congress to pass, the Dream and Promise Act, whatever the case might be. There's actually so much that we can do at the state level, at the local level as well. So the 3 things I want to highlight are 3 bills that we're working on specifically in the Maryland General Assembly. The first one is super simple. It's called the Protecting Sensitive Locations Act, which is actually being led by the chair of the Black Caucus, who is an immigrant herself. And shout out to the chair of the Black Caucus, Delegate Janelle Wilkins, who's an immigrant from Jamaica. But what that bill does is it limits ICE access to what we call sensitive locations, right? Schools, courthouses, hospitals, medical facilities, places where people need to go and get their basic needs met. And, they shouldn't have to worry about whether dropping their kid off at school is going to get them separated from their family, right? Or going to, the doctor or going to a hospital is going to get them deported. So what the bill does is it requires the Attorney General's office to create guidance, right, limiting ICE access into these places. There was a federal policy that had been in place for several years, actually, that was stripped on day one of the Trump administration on January 20th. That didn't cover everything, but it at least gave us some assurance that ICE was not going to go into these places, that people could still take their kids to school, they could go volunteer at school, they could take their kids to the hospital, right? That victims can go to the courthouse, right? Without fear of being deported. So that's an emergency bill. It just made it through on crossover day yesterday. So we'll see. We got to get that to the finish line. It's an extremely important bill. The second bill I want to mention is the Maryland Data Privacy Act. This is a bill that essentially stops ICE from having access to state and local agency data without a warrant. And so, a lot of people ask, seriously, is ICE going into state and local agency data? The answer is yes, absolutely, they are. And actually, we have a pretty significant example here in Maryland. Some people might remember a couple years ago, we passed driver's license for all in Maryland. So anyone, regardless of your immigration status, can go and get your driver's license, right? Now, that bill passed, and actually the focus of that bill was actually on public safety, right? Like folks who have their driver's license are more likely to have insurance, the streets are safer, et cetera, et cetera. Passed driver's license for all, hundreds of people, right? There are around 300,000 undocumented immigrants in Maryland. Thousands of people go and get their driver's license. Shortly after, we start to see ICE pickups happen. People who have done nothing but get their driver's license, right? What we had found out, and actually was a CASA member, a big CASA member story, ICE had knocked on their door early in the morning. Kids are in the pajamas. He gets handcuffed, gets picked up by ICE. And he just asks ICE directly, how did you get my information? ICE casually says, we got it from the MDGA. So that right there is one example, right, of ICE going into agency data. What we found out since then is that ICE was just logging on. They were using facial recognition technology. They were just doing wide searches, discriminatory searches, and using that information to find people and deport them. Now, in 2021, we passed a bill to stop ICE from having access to the MVA database, but it only covered the MVA. Now, enforcement is ramping up. We're really concerned about pretty much all of the other agencies, right? All of the other agencies that ICE could dig into and do the same exact thing and abuse. And they have done in other states. We don't want that happening in Maryland. But like Medicaid is an example, right? Where if you're undocumented, you can apply for Medicaid if you're pregnant, right? There are folks who are applying for emergency rental assistance, people who are paying taxes. We pay billions of dollars in taxes, right? The comptroller was actually one of the biggest voices in the fight for this legislation. So anyway, it's sort of the same premise of the Sensitive Locations Act, is that people should be able to go and get their basic services met without fear that their information, that their data will be shared with immigration enforcement. And for that matter, now, any other federal agency, which pretty much is all of them now, right, that can play a role in immigration enforcement. And then the last bill, and then I'll pause there. The last bill is perhaps in some ways one of the most important bills. that is going to really make a dent in slowing down Trump's mass deportation plan. And that is called the Values Act. What the bill does is it ends 287G agreements. And for those who are not familiar with 287G agreements, 287G agreements are, it's a federal program that allows local sheriffs to enter into contracts with ICE. And what the contracts do is they allow local police officers to be deputized as ICE agents, right? So for anyone who's been following the immigration work in Maryland for a while, you may know that, you know, our police departments, our correctional facilities coordinate with ICE quite a bit. That's something we've been trying to stop for a very long time, actually, for like decades at CASA. But yeah, they collaborate with ICE a lot. 287G is a sort of a step beyond that, okay? 287G is not us helping ICE. 287G is us becoming ICE, right? Police officer is not notifying ICE that someone's here or transferring. They themselves are ICE through the program, right? So there are a number of police officers who are deputized through the 287G program who can essentially act as an ICE agent, right? Question people about their immigration status, issue detainers, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there were 3 287G agreements in Maryland, in Frederick, Harford, and Cecil County. One of the most famous ones was in Frederick, because they've had, I think, actually one of the oldest in the country. But Sheriff Jenkins, you know, has a very famous history of racial profiling, right? And 287G is a part of that. Since Trump took office, 3 new counties, Garrett, Washington, and Carroll County, have now entered into 287G agreements as well. The administration has been, and, you know, ICE in Maryland have been really aggressively targeting other counties to enter into new agreements. So anyway, what the bill does is it ends all of those current agreements, which was 3, now 6 287G agreements, and it prevents any other counties from entering in to those agreements, right? This bill is absolutely critical. And for those who have followed the maybe like a billion executive orders on immigration, you can look at those and see very clearly, to carry out this mass deportation plan, their plan is to use state and local resources, right? That is just very clear. They 287G is one of their core tactics that they plan to use, right? So DHS, right, has, I don't know if where they are on the budget at this point, but last year's budget, $9.6 billion, right? They have ICE agents everywhere. 287G is basically saying we want more ICE agents. We want anyone who is a police officer to become ICE, right? To join us and help us carry out not what our locals, who our locals believe, you know, should or should not be deported, right? But to carry out what Trump's agenda is, essentially, right? So that's the bill. It's been going through a rocky process, the legislative process. But all 3 of these bills are going to be major steps that we can take to not stop completely, but at least slow down, right? What we're seeing at the federal level right now.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I'm glad, you know, we kind of started with that, because where I want really the majority of our conversation to go is, and, you know, I talked about in the beginning, you and I talked about it a little bit earlier, which is we're seeing the politicization of notions of inherent Black criminality. And I think there's a way that kind of societal notion that was a part of the process of mass incarceration. So the rhetoric, images, narratives of Black folks as inherently criminal, in many ways is being cross-applied, right, to brown folks, right? And that in many ways, when we think about mass incarceration was a part of a political strategy, right, by Republicans initially to gain ground on the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. And the Democrats politicized it because there was a base of white folks who had abandoned the Democratic Party that they felt they could capture by using that same rhetoric and those images and those narratives. It's my sense that that is, again, they're pulling from that very playbook when it comes to many of these issues, right? And even when you think about Trump's rhetoric about dealing with immigration and the conservatives, it is about dealing with violent immigrants, right? That's the kind of the rhetoric and images and narratives they're using.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about that and talk about it, particularly in the context of how that is weaponized against the legislative efforts that you've described?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just 1000% everything you just said. I mean, and I think what is often missing from the conversation is the fact that, you know, the hatred of immigrants, the hatred of brown people, right? Or of whatever, of people of color, right? As a whole stems from anti-Blackness. All of it can be kind of connected back to, right, this hatred that people have of Black people, right? And I think that this is why it's so important that this conversation is framed in a Black liberation framework, because that is the basis of basically freedom for everybody else, right? Period. But yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing, right, is this conversation around all immigrants being criminals uh, being normalized, right? Which the Republican Party has been very effective at doing, right? And we all know we can turn on whatever news channel, right? Honestly, so many even Latino media outlets have been bought out, right? And you hear the same thing over and over again, right? A plane crashes, totally random, right? This must be because of illegal immigration. That must be because, MS-13 is coming into our country, et cetera, et cetera. What we're not seeing from the opposite party is the alternative to that, which is all immigrants are not criminals. Also, not just not criminals, are not people who committed crimes, or even like a even tighter than that, right? Like what we're not hearing is immigrants are people. Period. There's just actually no strong response. And actually the fact that we're moving legislation in Maryland is extremely powerful. And I don't want to undercut the really powerful and amazing work that is being done, again, by so many Black leaders in Maryland in particular. But I would say broadly, right, like we are not seeing a strong response from the party on this, right? And we haven't seen that for like a very, very, very long time.
If I can interject real quick.
Yeah, of course.
Because on that point, because when we say the party, you're talking about the Democratic Party.
Yes.
And it not being strong in its response. And I think one of the things that my observation is that, and there are a bunch of different conclusions one can draw,
Mm-hmm.
but to me, the most sensible one is that it is indicative of places where the Democrats agree with Republicans in ways that they don't want to admit. So you talk about anti-Blackness. There are ways that there's certain elements of the Democratic Party constituency that are scared of Black people, right? Scared of brown people. And there are media narratives that, as you said, they get, cycled over and over again, where they use this on issues that we work on. One of the reasons why I think this conversation is good in terms of framing it this way, the same loop of violent crime that they will loop a handful of incidents over and over and over again,
Mm-hmm.
to say, look at this crime wave. I think it's really similar to what I see about stories about immigrants who commit crime. They pick the worst scenarios and then they extrapolate it to something that is endemic. So continue, and if you can add how that impacts the policies, the pushback on the policies or the attempts to obscure even some of the policies that you talk about.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It shows where there's alignment, right, between the parties, and that basically the same racist ideologies, right, are embedded in the Democratic Party as well. So 100%. I mean, so what is happening is that there's this conversation happening around making sure that police officers do not become ICE, right? And because there is this conversation uh, around immigrants being criminals, right? It's turned into this culture of fear of Black and brown people, right? And so what that's done is what we've seen is like amendments added, right? For example, to the Values Act that would actually mandate the notification and transfer of certain individuals who have committed certain crimes to ICE, right? Which, by the way, are things that are coming from this majority Democratic committee, right? Committee and General Assembly as a whole. And I think like the conversation has been like, this is what we need to reach a fair balance, when in reality, right, if we really did not believe, right, in these racist ideologies, we would say, no, actually, we're not going to mandate any collaboration with ICE, period, right? Because we know what kind of agency that is, a rogue agency that has a long history of mistreatment of Black and brown people. So there actually is no level, right, of collaboration with ICE that is appropriate. Now, the localities are doing that, right? That's like a whole nother conversation. But at the state level, right, we don't want to weaken ways that localities have the ability to make those decisions, right? Um, I think like it connects this work connects so deeply to, I think, like the broader, I mean, the multiple like criminal justice fights that are happening, right? Is this sort of, I don't know, to put it in kind of layman's terms, right? Like if you commit a crime and you supposedly, right, we're not going to talk about the system as it is, but supposedly you serve your time and justice is served, right? You go back and you're a person, you should be able to finish your life. You're still a parent, you're still a loved one, you're still a family member, and I think like we see this in again, all of the conversations that we have all the time, right? Where like, if you were convicted of something, served your time, you can't get a job, you can't, your whole life, you're basically punished for your whole life, right? So when we're talking about ICE being transferred to ICE, it's like, all right, you've committed a crime, you've served your time, no matter what it is, right? Whether it's 30 days, 30 years, right? When you're done, right, should you be punished for life, right? And in this case, the punishment being, will you be you know exiled from the country, right? And so, which, in my opinion, at what level should we even be making a decision that someone should be exiled from the country, right? So like, all that to say is that, you know individual people come to the US for a variety of different reasons, right? um Seeking a better life, fleeing their home country, there's political unrest, there's a climate disaster, or in many cases, those things were caused by US intervention, which is a whole nother separate thing, right? And so for us to be deciding whether or not someone is worthy, right, to be here when there is not even a pathway for those individuals, right, to get relief is just a level of cruel that I think is really difficult to put into words.
And I remember before we got on, we were talking about like what are some of those carve outs, right? We talked about before was like DUIs, right? And to me, what's interesting about that is, well, two things. One, if we're clear about the system, the criminal justice system being racist, being that, you know, people of color, Black folks are more likely to be interacting with law enforcement, more likely to come in contact with it than a person with any of the, you know, something as small as a DUI, right, can be used as a mechanism to carry out a political agenda, which is to get folks out of there, which is similar to when you think about like stop and frisk, right, which is a policy who it wasn't about safety, right? It was about using it as a political tool to be able to accomplish its ultimate objective, right? And that's different from saying that we're okay with DUIs, right? Because we're not saying like we're okay with DUIs. We're saying that we know that the agenda of ICE and law enforcement generally is to use whatever mechanisms it can use to ultimately end up at their objective. And one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking is in many ways, and I don't think it's talked about this way, that deportation is an extension of mass incarceration, right?
Absolutely.
In you know, and so just the way that it's weaponized against our people in ways that it's not weaponized against white folks, I think demonstrates the kind of like it's clearly politicized. You know what I mean? So last question before we turn to, you know, you telling people how they can help, is, are there, again, I mentioned the DUI example. What would you say to someone who says, I'm down for making sure that folks are not getting deported. I don't want people who are immigrants that are criminals having the opportunity to be in Maryland. And so why would you oppose something that would identify the crimes, the kinds of crimes that we don't want people to be doing in the United States? What would you say to someone who says, I want policies that reflect that none of these crimes are crimes that are the things that will protect a person who's an immigrant? What would you say to that person?
Right. Well, you know, what's funny is I think that you actually just answered that question very clearly, right? Is that the individuals who are in that category, right, are there through an extremely racist system. And that doesn't mean, like you just said, that we're not fighting to protect public safety. Like, obviously, we don't want people driving drunk, right? But and I just was pulling it up to find the statistic. I couldn't find it, but it's something like less than the Black immigrant undocumented population is around like 9%, right? Or 9% Black immigrants make like 9% of the total undocumented population. Even though that's true, they make about 20% of those facing deportation specifically on criminal grounds, right? So that right there shows you, right, how our people are disproportionately impacted, right? So if we're already more likely to be stopped by the police, pulled over by the police, you know, have harsher charges, have harsher convictions, right? that means we are also more likely to be moved to ICE detention, transferred to ICE, just sort of broadly across the board, right? And ultimately deported, right? And so I think like for those who are, you know, concerned about this, and concerned about public safety as a whole, I mean, what I would say is that this is a time for us not to succumb to what we're seeing and hearing in the media about our people, right? And to really think thoughtfully about why it is that predominantly Black and Brown folks, Black and Brown immigrants, although we have a very large white immigrant population as well, why it is that those are the individuals who are in detention to begin with, right? For us to think compassionately, right, around the immigration system, the extremely broken and racist immigration system as it is, which already doesn't allow a pathway for many of our people to get the relief that they need if they are fleeing their home country, right? Or if they're here for whatever the reason may be, right? And so, I think like this, there's this sort of conversation happening at the same time of individuals who are asking like, well, my family came here legally, why don't you just go back home, come here legally, and then go through the process, right? Like, as we're making these decisions about who should or should not be deported, it's important to know that like there is no process for so many of these individuals. Like there is no pathway. And actually, even the pathways that do exist are being stripped, right? And like, for example, TPS, temporary protected status, is a form of humanitarian relief, right? TPS was just canceled for Venezuela. Guess where else it was canceled for? Haiti. TPS was just canceled for Haiti. So there's a whole bunch of Haitians who meet the qualifications for TPS, which means essentially that it is unsafe for them to return to their home country, right? Because they have experienced some kind of, again, political unrest, natural disaster, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the right way would be to come here, right? You fled your home country, right? There's no time to do anything. You just need to get to safety. You fled your home country. The right thing to do would be to go figure out how to apply for TPS, make a case for yourself. I'm not even get into the problems with the process, but make a case for yourself, right? Hopefully get your TPS approved, right? And then have that protection from deportation, get your work permit, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you have TPS, number one, there's no pathway to citizenship, right? So it stops there. But number two is that TPS just got canceled for Haiti. So now what do we say to all those people who just are here now undocumented, who are now going to be forced to live in the shadows, right? Who are not going to be eligible for a whole bunch of stuff now because of their status, and who we now know are more likely to be criminalized, right? And so, what I ask people to do is to think thoughtfully, right? To think with your hearts about the extremely complicated and racist nature of the systems that we're being forced to work within, right? And that should be informing our policy decisions, right? Not these headlines that we're seeing that are generalizing an entire community of individuals based off of one story.
So tell us, Kat, what can people do to help? So these three bills that you mentioned, you talked a little bit about the posture that they're in. talk to us in the last few minutes that we have about how people can be helpful.
Okay, so there's so many things. First and foremost, if you have not reached out to your senators and delegates and asked them to vote yes on these bills, please do that. The calls do matter. The emails do matter. So email them, call them, and let them know I am supporting CASA's immigrant justice package. Do I have your support? Do I have your vote? They need to hear from tons and tons of people. There's so much going on right now. The budget, right? There's like just a million different things happening. The focus has been on like federal workers, right? In a way that is masking, I think, like the urgency of this issue in particular. So reach out. When I tell you we have about 20-ish days left of the session, reach out every day, every single day. It makes the world of a difference. I'm going to tell you really quickly the status of the bill. So the Data Privacy Act and the Sensitive Locations Act have passed in the Senate. Okay, so what we're trying to do now, from now to April 7th, is get them through the House. Those bills are in really good shape. They're making their way, and I think we're on track. But folks are feeling really scared about what's happening right now. So even if your senator or delegate supported this, still reach out to them, tell them thank you, and we need your courage to get the rest of these bills to the finish line. Okay. Now on 287G, the Values Act in particular, that bill has passed in the House, and opposite from the other two bills, instead, we've got to get it passed in the Senate now. So for the Values Act, reach out to your senator. Also, you want to reach out always, right, to Senate leadership, right? The president's office, President Ferguson's office. You want to reach out to the individuals who are on the Judicial Proceedings Committee as well. And also reach out to the governor's office, right? The governor needs to know that this is a top priority, that we need to get this bill on his desk. The really important thing that I want folks to share as well is that you support and you stand with CASA's amendments to the Values Act, okay? So what we want to do is keep the bill that is ending 287G, that's going to stop our partnerships with ICE. And we want to get out the additional language that has mandated, right, that we transfer certain individuals to ICE based off of certain crimes that they've committed. We don't want that in the bill, so call them, let them know you want a clean Values Act passed in the Senate, okay? So those are the things. Keep an eye out. We will probably be having a rally on the 27th of March. So March 27th, keep an eye out for information about that. We need as many people there in person to put the political pressure on, to make sure they know that there are tons of people, tons of eyes watching them.
Well, look, thanks, Kat, for having this conversation. As I mentioned at the top, I think the connection between the issues that that we work on and you all work on overlap, really neatly. And so, I think this is a good way of like sussing that out. I want to encourage all those who are listening. Kat just gave you all the ways to be supportive. So please, do that. I'm sure you all on social media and have a website where people can get all that information, Kat.
Yes, absolutely. We are CASA.org. You go to that website, you'll see all the information about our Maryland Immigrant Justice Package. You can also find us on Instagram, where we post live updates on exactly where the bills are, so you can keep track there and make sure you're reaching out to the appropriate people.
All right, so that sounds good. So once again, it's Cathryn Paul from CASA. Thanks for coming on. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Please keep tuning in. We'll probably be back next week to give some more updates. And so safe travels.